going around, it is a little bit less than what it has been in the preceding months.
Yeah. And I mean, the numbers, I think we're all just becoming a little bit numb to it because actually the numbers are still quite high. Higher than they were at the beginning of the pandemic. But because we've gotten used to it, right? Humans adapt, and we're tired of wearing masks and things. We're trying to deal with the fact that we still have COVID, but it's still happening along with a lot of other respiratory viruses that are circulating right now.
And since we've been on this holiday binge that we're in, do you expect to see, an uptick given Thanksgiving? And
yeah, I remember. So we both are practicing physicians, right, at Lucille Packard. And I often am on around these holidays on service in the hospital. And definitely we do see upticks. We see upticks whenever humans congregate and get together like they do at Thanksgiving and over all the different holidays of the season. People get together and they share their germs. So yes, we expect to see probably little bumps in COVID. How high? We don't know, but we do know that it's more than COVID just circulating right now. There's a lot of respiratory viruses out there making a lot of people sick. So,
and can you touch on that? Because we have a weird combination going now with COVID plus these respiratory, plus we've got flu and cold.
Absolutely.
And so what are recommendations right now around how to protect yourself with all of these things going on?
Yeah, well, I'll say, so we have COVID circulating right now. I was just on service in the hospital recently. So we have COVID, we have influenza A, we have human metapneumovirus, respiratory syncytial virus, parainfluenza virus, rhinovirus, enterovirus. So, when we were all protecting ourselves really well from COVID, when we all, at the very beginning of the pandemic, right, almost there were no other respiratory viruses that were circulating, but now they've come back with a vengeance, right? And so probably many people are sick right now, maybe watching this Ding Ding TV, and they're doing their COVID test, but they're negative. Well, they may have one of these other viruses, right? And the thing about respiratory viruses is you protect yourself in the same way, right?
Yeah, for the most part, I think that like a lot of the respiratory viruses are transmitted the same way. So by contact or by like little droplets. And so when people were masking much more uniformly and being careful not to contract COVID or transmit COVID, we were being careful not to transmit some of these other viruses as well. I think that it's been much more relaxed of late. And so that's why we're seeing this increase in respiratory viruses.
Yeah. And the scary thing is actually, the viruses are one thing. You can be very sick from a virus, but sometimes what happens is that you get a super infection from bacteria. And so then you get even sicker. And then you need antibiotics and sometimes hospitalization. And so we're also starting to see upticks in super infections of these viral infections.
Yeah. So playing off of that, what are your recommendations if somebody has cold or flu symptoms, or they don't know if they might have COVID? What are your recommendations for them besides maybe taking a COVID test and making sure it's not that? What's the protocol here for the normal person that has symptoms or is showing symptoms of something?
Yeah, I think that regardless of whether or not it's COVID, whether it's RSV or influenza, I think that if you are feeling sick, then you probably shouldn't be exposing others to your illness or your infection. It's most likely you're infected with something. You're not, totally healthy and uninfected. You're just infected with something that perhaps you don't really know what it is. And it's really kind of on you to really protect the people that are around you and people you love.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to follow on that, if you are living with someone or close with someone who has less of a robust immune system as you do for whatever reason, maybe it's, they're getting chemotherapy or they have an immunosuppressed condition or a young baby or at the extremes of age, an older person, you of course want to protect yourself and those vulnerable folks that you're around by being very cautious with your protection. And then of course you asked like, what are recommendations? If you're very sick, of course, seek medical care.
Yes.
Of course. Yes. That's probably the first thing that I should have said.
Absolutely. So just because your COVID test is negative doesn't mean that you're not very sick. So if you feel very sick, please seek care.
Go ahead. And as we're talking about that, and as if you're showing symptoms at all, your recommendation, I know we should be not going out, but we do have a lot of people, right, who just think, oh, I have allergies or I have the sniffles or even if they have a slight fever, right? So what are your thoughts of anyone showing any type of symptoms? Is it just stay home?
I think that's a tough question because we all want to join family members and celebrate. And I think that you're right. There are going to be people who are, well, it's just a sniffles or and just, my nose in the morning is a little bit runny. I think that's kind of inevitable to really want to get together with family members. I think that the best thing is really to resist that. In the absence of being resisting that, I think that other ways that we can protect ourselves are actually to wear masks, wash hands, kind of limit the potential exposure or our exposure if we're infectious to the people that are around us.
Again, most of these respiratory infections are spread by droplets, right? So again, that's why there was that 3 to 6 feet, right, distance when we were early on in the pandemic that everyone was really trying to adhere to. It's the same thing with most of these respiratory infections. So again, eat outside if you have to go, or wear a mask for sure. Wash your hands frequently.
And do you both still recommend keeping that 3 to 6 feet difference around strangers, or are you?
Well, I think that
kind of
like
wavering?
when that's possible, I think that that's just in general good advice.
You're talking to 2 infectious disease patients here. Trust me, I've been making people wash my hands and wash their hands on entry to my home forever.
Which is something we should all be doing at this point too. And I appreciate both of you doing that. So we've been talking about COVID and people that are testing negative for COVID, but you could still potentially have something. Now that the government is not offering free testing or as many free testing, and we probably will see a lot of people foregoing the test altogether. Are there any other thoughts or recommendations that you would have with that in mind for the general population, thinking about there are limited tests out there? There are a lot of people who just do have that fear of missing out and want to be places. So I know you've mentioned the masks and washing your hands. Anything else, or are we just stressing the washing your hands and being very vigilant?
Well, there are a number of things that you can protect do to protect yourself. You can't protect yourself against all of the different viruses, but influenza, you can get some partial immunity, from previous infection, but really getting the vaccine every year is probably going to be your best chance at really reducing both your disease if you get infected, and also likely it probably affects whether or not how efficiently you transmit it too. I think that making sure that you're up to date in your vaccinations is one thing, and kind of developing kind of a universal strategy to being healthy, which we would argue includes washing hands and using masks. It's not a huge burden compared to the gains that you get.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of other tools, right? We're really just trying to protect ourselves from getting infected. So vaccines, 100% for sure.
And being proactive, right? I think when we're thinking about our health, a lot of us think reactively and just choose to fix things once they go wrong. So I think really having that proactive.
Getting enough sleep, drinking water, exercising, all the ways that we keep our bodies healthy, right? Are going to help you from getting
eating well.
ill. Exactly.
Yeah, all of those things go into it. Now you had touched on immunity, and I know that there's a lot of talk out there about antibodies, and we have antibody testing and we've got antibody studies. What are your recommendations around antibodies? Because there are now antibody tests in the store, and maybe if there isn't a COVID test available, somebody may think, oh, I'll take an antibody test and I've got antibodies, so I'm okay. Does that make sense to you?
No. Sorry.
Well, I think, well, first off, antibodies are important. We know that when we give antibodies to people who don't have antibodies, they get at least some partial protection. So antibodies are important, but it's not been shown to be what is called the surrogate of protection, meaning that it doesn't predict protection. And so we don't really know what that is. So we may have antibodies, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you're protected. We assume so. And for a lot of different diseases, that's the case. But for COVID, I don't think that's been shown yet. And I think that it's a little bit of a leap to assume that if you have antibodies that you're protected and you're not going to transmit. I think that, there are plenty of people who get COVID multiple times and they have antibodies, but they're not protected. And so I think that you have to keep that in mind, that just because there is some marker of potential protection, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're actually protected.
Yeah, not to mention all the different variants, right? So, those kits, they're going to give you you can imagine sort of a general antibody test for COVID, but whether or not those antibodies are actually going to protect you from the variant that's circulating in your community right then, you don't really know. And so it's quite nuanced.
Yeah, and it's a good point, because I told you earlier, David, that I as well thought, oh, I have antibodies, I'm safe, and realizing that that's not really the case. So I think we all learn things every day that really are essential in that preventative type of state that we're in.
Not to mention also that, we don't know how long these antibodies stay. So maybe even if you do have protective antibodies that might neutralize the virus and actually keep you safe from that variant, we don't know how long those antibodies persist, and if they're different in different people. Is it different in children versus adults? So there's a lot of questions.
Right.
And there's all the variants.
So that's a big, it's good to know. And I think it's something that we all need to think about, because it is such a strange space that we're in. I don't think we've ever experienced anything like this before. So a lot of us are traveling during the holidays, and I know myself, I've been on a plane a couple of times, and there are a lot of people that are unmasked on
so
these
awful.
planes. So any recommendations of your traveling? I know I've heard don't eat on a plane, right? Make sure you have, the best quality mask. So what are your N95 is what you're still recommending? Any other thoughts if you happen to be getting on a plane this holiday season?
Well, I think that wearing a mask is a must. I have been on a plane recently, and I feel like I'm the only one with a mask.
I feel you.
And it does kind of feel a little bit weird, but
so be it.
So be it.
Absolutely.
Yeah. It's I can feel a little bit weird about it. It's better than getting sick.
Yeah.
The other thing also, this is going to sound really sort of hypochondriacal, but if you happen to be seated there in a plane and you're around someone who's coughing, asked to be moved.
Yeah.
I've actually done that. I've asked, they move you. I'm like, I don't want to sit here because this person is coughing. And they're like, okay, we'll find you a new seat.
Yeah.
So
good advice. And also for those of you out there, if you are traveling, airlines now do not carry masks on board anymore.
So bring extra.
So bring extra masks, because I've been in that situation where I've had to buy an extra because the one I had, had gotten dirty or whatever it was. So make sure if you are traveling by plane, you have your own stash of supplies. But eating on the plane, what are your thoughts?
If it's a short flight, I wouldn't.
Yeah, I think kind of anything to avoid exposing yourself, if you can avoid it. Certainly, like it's hard not to drink any water or anything. So I think avoiding it as much as possible.
Yeah, and a lot of the risk from airline travel is actually not on the plane itself, because they do filter the air, circulate it a lot, run it through HEPA filters, and so the air on the plane oftentimes is actually quite clean and it's circulated. In the airport, actually, you have millions more people coughing without masks.
Yeah.
So that's actually potentially sometimes more dangerous, is your time within the airport.
Yeah.
So again,
it's interesting that you say that, because everybody, there is
think
that
it's about the plane.
Everybody thinks it's the plane, but you get out into the airport and everyone's taking off their masks, right? Because they were just on that plane.
So I'm unsure if there's a lot of data about force of infection in airplane versus airport.
Yeah,
I venture to say that maybe the airport's actually.
I would say that the airport is probably more dangerous.
It's more dangerous.
Yeah.
So again, keeping yourself away from people, distancing yourself as you can, because you probably will eat in the airport or something, right? So just separating yourself, washing your hands, cleaning your place, with your wipes or whatever when you get on the plane.
Yeah. I do that as well, as carrying, the disposable wipes to wipe down the
Mhm.
plane, just in
Purell,
case,
so-
making sure. So
Yeah.
having those preventative type of measures is one of the recommendations you both have, right? It's
Mhm.
really taking that.
Yeah, you never know when someone's going to sneeze on you, so it's good
And
to
I've
be
seen that in
prepared.
slow motion. So obviously we do think that it is a little bit dangerous with people out there not masking anymore. And your recommendations are really for people to continue wearing a mask, correct?
I would when you're in crowded places. I mean, again, these are our own personal recommendations as infectious
Yeah.
disease physicians, right? But
Yeah.
we would say, I think so. I mean, I do.
Yeah,
It's what I do and try to get my children to do.
Yeah.
yeah,
I mean, I think that there's like evidence that they work because we did see that all of the respiratory viruses like didn't really kind of cause the infections that they usually did the previous years. And I think that it's pretty safe to attribute that to the mask, that we're not doing anything different to kind of combat RSV except keeping distance and using a mask, washing our hands. So I think that those things work. And I think that, you have these as tools that you can use for most viral infections, whether or not it's COVID or something else.
yeah. So what do you say to those naysayers who are just like, well, I
They're
don't
just
need to wear
tired.
it. Yeah.
Yeah. I
They're
mean, I
just
get
tired.
it. People are frustrated. They're exhausted. It's uncomfortable to wear a mask for long periods of time. We're just all tired of it. We want to go back to the way things were.
Yeah.
So I understand how people are tired. I would just say, do what you can,
Yeah.
Especially if you're in crowded places.
Yeah.
And especially if you have someone at home that is particularly vulnerable to a more severe disease,
Yeah.
I would really wear your mask.
Yeah, I'm immune compromised myself. So I always, when people say that they refuse to wear a mask around me, I always say this is not for you. It's more for my protection,
Yeah. It's just a matter of courtesy. So common courtesy to your fellow human.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it, because I think we do need that, especially in these times where tempers and everything is raising up and we're just in a very interesting space.
I would say courtesy and science.
And science. You can back it by
I
science.
want COVID, but I don't want RSV either.
Right.
Metapneumovirus
Right.
or enterovirus.
I don't want the flu.
I don't want the flu. I got my
No.
vaccine, but you never know if
Yeah.
the vaccine is going to protect you. Exactly right.
Yeah, and it may not be 100% protective. Like, it may not be, just protected or not protected, but there may be a spectrum.
Agree.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think any little bit of percentage that you can up, in that protection is valuable. You mentioned vaccines.
Yes.
So we're going to hit on that really quick. We have all of these vaccines and requirements and boosters, and how many vaccines should someone take?
All of them. Yeah. So we have our COVID vaccines, and now we have the bivalent, right? So we have, because all of the different variants. And so, looking into the crystal ball, we imagine that there's probably going to be different vaccines that we're going to need to take on a yearly basis, sort of like the influenza vaccine, where they kind of guess at what variants are going to be circulating. And then you get vaccinated and hope that that's going to protect you. Same with influenza. Unfortunately, a lot of the other things we don't have vaccines for, a lot of these other respiratory viruses we're speaking of right now.
Yeah.
So as far as COVID vaccines go, as the virus continues to mutate and create new variants, we need to continue to protect ourselves as best we can.
Yeah.
And you see this more as kind of like a flu vaccine, right? That's gonna, next year when different variants or different changes come, we adjust that vaccine.
Potentially, I would imagine. So
I would agree. I think that if I were to kind of, guess, I would guess that it will probably act similar to the influenza, where, the virus is already always mutating and always evolving. And so we're basically trying to catch up. And this year, last year, Omicron really kind of sprung up. This year so far, the prediction is not so dire, but we never know when.
But still, for a few people, it could be,
Yeah.
which I think is still important to stress, that preventative, right? Because
Yeah.
it could be dangerous for others.
yeah, I mean, and again, we're talking about an RNA virus here that mutates quite rapidly. and a world where there isn't equal and equitable distribution of vaccines. So we have millions of people who are still unvaccinated in the world, right? And so there's always potential there for more variants to emerge, with a lot of susceptible people who are spreading virus. And so until we have a vaccinated world.
And with the vaccines, we have so many different coming out. Is it just kind of what they give you is what, because we've heard that right in the beginning when we had all of
I know
these
which
different
one do you want?
vaccines.
Yeah.
It's very confusing.
And so is your recommendation just to take what's out there? Because I think
That is
that's pretty
yeah,
better than nothing.
I think that it's better than nothing. Certainly there are differences in the vaccines. There's a difference in how effective certain vaccines are. When you look at vaccine candidates, like, from around the world, for example, but that beats not having any. And so I think that all of the vaccines have been shown to at least induce some antibody response, and so probably do contribute towards some immunity. And so having a little bit is probably better than none, and having a little bit more is probably better than having a little bit.
Yeah, and I have to say that, everyone hears the word vaccine and they think, oh, good, I'm going to take this vaccine and I expect it to give me 100% protection. That isn't always the case, right? That is the ideal. That is what everyone who's preparing a vaccine and manufacturing one hopes for. But I mean, in this virus, even wild type virus, right? Even people who get COVID, then they get it again.
Mhm.
So even you facing the virus and your amazing immune system trying to fight it is not 100% protective.
Yeah.
So the vaccine's not going to protect you 100%. Your infection with COVID that you had a few months ago is also not going to protect you 100%. So it's just, it sucks to get COVID. I think we've all had COVID.
Yeah.
And so it's really just try to keep yourself well.
Yeah.
Do what you can.
Yeah.
And I like that you mentioned that as well, because I do hear a lot of people say, I just had it, so I can't get it again.
Which, yeah,
And so I think that's a big myth out there that people
It
really need
is.
it really is.
to know.
It is a myth. I think that, it's not kind of an unreasonable expectation or reasonable desire.
It's a dream.
Yeah.
It's why I get my vaccines. I want to be protected.
Yeah,
Of course.
yeah, absolutely.
But I think it's all additive, like David suggests.
Yeah. And question for you, because you're both pediatricians. And so where do you see the vaccine going? I know a lot of people out there probably have children that they're worried about. And do you give the vaccines to children? So what are your thoughts as pediatricians and looking at this younger population who may be,
Mhm.
exposed to different things?
Yeah. Well, kids transmit stuff. So
And they
I
get sick
think,
with stuff.
yeah, they get
Yeah.
sick. I'm very pro-vaccine. So I think that vaccines are safe. There are a lot of studies to kind of look at vaccine safety before they even go into humans. I think that kind of given the safety of them, you can really only reap the benefits of the vaccines. So I know that there will probably be people who disagree,
Yeah.
but
Vaccines save lives.
yeah.
That's it. Vaccines save lives.
I agree with both of you. And I think too, I hear a lot of talk around clinical trials and how these things are rushed, but I think one thing that we all have to think about is we now had a sample size, right? A population of
Right.
people that we have never been able to look at in the same way. And you've got, usually when you run trials on vaccines and things like that, right? Or not vaccines, but drugs, they're small samples of populations. So we actually tested this and actually had huge populations of people. And this wasn't mixed up in a lab the night before, which
No.
some
Right.
people like to
No.
assume, right? These are long processes that go into the vaccines.
Yeah.
And so in that, I mean, you both see very huge advantages to having vaccines. What do you say to anyone who might be objecting? Like, what would your one last statement be to somebody who says, I don't need a vaccine, I've already had COVID, or whatever it may be? What's your...
I mean, I think it's not about just one statement. I think that's the point. I think when people refuse vaccines, you need to find out why. You need to
Yeah.
find out where the misinformation lies or what the worry is or the fear. And you have to get to the root of that. because different people have different reasons why they might be deciding not to vaccinate, even though, vaccines save lives. It's the one, and I think the most powerful infectious disease intervention of our lifetime for the least.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
absolutely.
And
Yeah.
I think looking at the past vaccines, right? Smallpox, things
Yeah.
that are no longer a
Yeah,
part of our
polio.
everyday life, polio, right?
Yeah.
And so do you see COVID kind of being extradited or extra, whatever the word is? Sorry.
Expedited?
No, I
No.
mean like kind of taken out of the picture.
Oh,
Yeah,
eradicated.
eradicated. There
In
you
the
go.
world? Oh, I doubt it.
No.
I don't think
It's
so.
just something we're
No, it's
probably
I don't
something we're gonna
think
have to live
so.
with, right?
Yeah.
Unfortunately.
I mean, coronaviruses have been with us for a long time, and
The animals.
yeah, and it's we haven't been able to kind of get the cure or vaccine for the common cold. So I don't see it going away.
No, absolutely not.
And what do you say to people who say like they just want to go back to normal? Because I think this was a wake up call for all of us,
Yeah.
right? I think our normal needed to change and we
Yeah.
need to take more of that proactive stance. But what are your thoughts?
Well, I think I sympathize. I would love for it to kind of go back to the way it was. I don't think that it ever will.
Yeah.
I think that we are in kind of a new world, and we have to adapt. And part of that adaptation is really kind of advocating for yourself and making those decisions to protect yourself in whichever ways you can.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I say to those people, you have to grieve your losses and move on, because it is a new normal that we're looking for. And all that we've learned over this pandemic, we need to take with us. We can't forget those lessons. And there was there were beautiful things that happened. There was a lot of beauty in some of this, right? And there was a lot of destruction and sadness and grief. And so I think it's, we do have to find that new normal and sort of integrate our new learnings about how to protect ourselves and our loved ones.
Yeah.
And then we need to move forward together. And during the next pandemic, we need to think about it being a worldwide thing, a pandemic, where we actually think about global health equity from the very beginning and vaccine distributions and doing it right together on one little blue marble, so that we get it right.
I think that's
Lots of lessons learned.
a huge thing, right? I think we have to take the lessons that we learned through all of this and really grow from there. And I agree with you that the global aspect of it seems to be ignored, even though it is a pandemic. And so really thinking about how we not only protect ourselves, but globally, as people travel and move between continents, how do we keep each other safe?
Yeah.
I think we are almost out of time. So any last remarks that you'd like to tell anyone out there around COVID and the holidays, besides we all want you to wash your hands and wear
and enjoy your holidays, because those things do not prevent you from doing so.
Yeah. I think that the main thing is that it's not just about COVID. Like there's a lot of other things that go around. And I think that we've learned how to effectively prevent those. During the times of COVID, I think that we saw that. If we can learn to use that knowledge to make our lives better, I think that's what I would kind of urge.
Yeah. And I guess my final thought is back to the interconnectedness. I mean, there's one thing that COVID taught us, is that we do live on a tiny little planet. We are all interconnected, and what we do actually is important for myself, my neighbors, my family, and even people across the world. And so just to remember that we have agency, there's opportunity to do the right thing. And so just keep doing it, even though it's inconvenient and annoying.
I enjoyed the conversation with the two of you, and we are out of time, and we hope that we answered some of your questions. And if you have any more, please feel free to leave them in the comments and we'll get back to you and answer those. But we want to thank Jeff Chow for bringing us our guests today, and both of you really for being here. Diana, for giving us the space and the opportunity to have this conversation. I think it's one that was definitely needed, and I hope that you guys will help us continue that conversation and spreading awareness around really get your vaccines, wear your masks. We are not through this yet, but hopefully we'll adapt. And thank you again, both of you, for being here.
Yeah, happy
you.
holidays. Thank you, Amy.
Yes, happy holidays. Thanks, Christine.
Yeah.
You're so sorry.
Yeah, I think so.
It was fun. I